regulations that were issued in 2010 included a requirement that institutions offering distance education or online programs, those institutions had to get authorization from each state in which they had a student enrolled in that distance ed program, if the state had a law or regulation requiring such approvals. Last year, a court case challenging that regulation and a few of the other regulations related to the Higher Ed Act led to a ruling that prevented that regulation from being implemented, but did not negate any state law or state regulation that required institutions from out of that state to get approval. And this led to the realization on the part of most nonprofit institutions of higher education that, in fact, most states had such rules and such laws. And unfortunately, every state has different rules, different definitions as to what requires approval, and different fee structures. The situation is further complicated as we discovered in attempting to get approvals for our distance ed programs by the fact that many states also require that their approval be obtained for educational activities within their state other than actually offering courses there unrelated to distance education, such as direct marketing, internships, and other factors which Brianna will talk about. So in the fall, to help us unravel this mess of regulations, we added to our team Brianna Bates as Accreditation Coordinator. Brianna came to us from the Distance Education and Training Council in Washington, D.C., which is a national accrediting agency, and her responsibilities there included both involvement in the accreditation process and in helping DETC accredited institutions to obtain state approvals. I'm delighted that already she's obtained approvals in a number of states for NYU, but there's a lot more to be done, and that's what we're here to talk about. And so I'll turn the meeting over to Brianna.
Thank you, Russ. So I think everyone here has at least heard the term state authorization. You've probably been reading several articles about it in the Chronicle and Inside Higher Ed, and it probably feels sort of like a roller coaster. Sometimes you see things that say, yes, you can do this. Sometimes you see things that say, no, you cannot do this, and it just probably seems very inconsistent and very confusing. So that's what this slide is, and the answer to most of your questions, unfortunately, is going to be, it depends. There are 51 different definitions of everything. Every state has created their own definition of what they consider to be a physical presence in their state. I was recently on a webinar where the presenter joked that there are so many different definitions of physical presence at this point. If we were to write them in a book, it's a book that nobody would want to read. And I can absolutely agree with that. So what we've tried to do and what we've been able to do is group these definitions of physical presence into various different triggers. So I'm going to go through and discuss different groupings or items that are individual triggers for state authorization within their state. So where are we going to go today? Where do you want to go? I think a lot of us would like to be on vacation or at the beach, but we're not. We're here talking about state authorization. So the individual triggers that I'm going to talk about today are your faculty state of residence, marketing and or advertising, proctoring, non-classroom experience, which includes but is not limited to internships, externships, clinicals, practicums, student teaching, fieldwork experiences, clerkships, etc. We're going to talk a little bit about the cost of state authorization, and then we're going to discuss what our peer institutions in the industry are doing about this. So I'd like to start with defining distance education. I know that a lot of people in this room have schools or programs that have components of distance education where you either have an entire program offered via distance education or maybe even just one course, or you might be discussing developing a distance education offering from the offerings that you already have. So that's great, and I just want everyone to be on the same page with the way that we're going to define distance education. So a system or process that connects learners with providers via distributed learning resources and is characterized by a separation of place and or time between the instructor and learners and or learners and learning resources. So this is the definition that we'll base our distance education discussions about today, but also please remember that there are a number of triggers that don't just relate to distance education. They also apply to our on-campus offerings in different areas of those offerings that I will discuss in detail as we progress through the presentation today. Just to put this in context before I continue to distance education offerings of how this really is real and applicable, I'll share one story that crossed my desk recently that really made state authorization a real issue. Walden University, which many of you may have heard of, is not authorized in the state of Maryland, but they had students doing a non-classroom experience in the state of Maryland, in particular as part of their nursing program. And Maryland has really beefed up their regulations, and the Department of Ed in Maryland went to the licensing board and they said, hey, if students from schools not on this list that are currently authorized come to you and want their licensure, you know, tell them to pause because their school needs to take some action in our state before we can grant their licensure because they were here out of compliance doing this. So now Walden University has a lot of students, unfortunately, in limbo, waiting on their school to take action before they can complete what they were originally there to complete. So just to kind of put this in context for all of you today, that's a recent issue that came up from this, and we don't want that to happen to our students. So we want to be proactive, and we want to work together to have this on our forefront and tackle it one state at a time. So that being said, our first trigger relates only to distance education offerings, and the states on this list are states where offering distance education alone to their residents triggers a need for state authorization. So as with the it depends, there's a notes section, and the notes are states that have various complexities where, for example, Alaska, if you have Alaskan residents enrolled in your distance education programs, that's fine, but they do ask that before you do that, you do apply for exemption within their state. So we just need to get a hold of our activity level here at NYU and make sure that we do the proper due diligence in each state so that we are operating in compliance across the board. The next trigger also has to do with distance education, and I will preface this with the next couple slides have the same setup. I'm going to have a map and a chart on each slide to explain the trigger to you. They are very small on your slides and your handouts as well as the screen, and that's on purpose. The full view of the map and the chart will be available for you to view as largely as you'd like in detail on our website, but this is just here to give you a scope of the geography of this particular trigger. So the maps and the charts are color-coded, and this trigger, as I said, applies to distance education offerings only. And this applies to where the faculty that you hire to provide your distance education reside. So some states feel that if you hire faculty that are residing in their state and filing taxes in their state, that constitutes a physical presence for them, and they see it almost as a consumer protection issue. It's probably the easiest way to define their view of this physical presence. And the state up there, the lonesome blue state, is Georgia, and I'll explain that because I don't think that this is happening at NYU, but it might be. Georgia specifies that if there's a faculty member employed in their state to give distance education to Georgia distance education enrolled students who are also residing in the state of Georgia, they feel it's a trigger because it's all happening there. They are the only state that falls into that category. All of the other states say if you hire faculty that live in our state and they're giving distance education to any NYU students that reside anywhere, we want to know about it, and you need to apply for state authorization within these states. The next trigger that will apply, from here on out they apply to everything, distance education offerings as well as our on-campus offerings. So if the previous ones didn't apply to you because your school or program does not have distance education offerings, from here on out they will apply to everyone. So marketing and or advertising. The map, as you see, has a little bit more color on it than the previous one. It's a couple more states consider this trigger to be a physical presence within their state. So I was able to divide it, the listing, into distance education specific advertising or general advertising for NYU as a whole. So to give you an example and put it in context, in the state of Oklahoma, if you are advertising specifically to recruit students to your distance education programs, and for Oklahoma there's an asterisk, which means they ask that you not target or mention their residents specifically in advertisements, then that is a trigger for state authorization. For all of the states listed in red and purple on the list, that speaks to general advertising. So if you have any advertising or marketing activity within your individual school that's taking place, this is a list of where local and national advertising triggers state authorization within that state. Advertising can be defined as television, print, radio, and then they also mention solicited and unsolicited mailing lists that you may purchase or have people sign up for. So this might not apply to everybody, but if it does apply to you, you also see that Massachusetts is the only purple state. They consider national advertising within their state to be a trigger for state authorization as well. For example, if you take an ad out in the New York Times and it's on a national scope and it's going to go to everyone, Massachusetts feels that because their residents will be viewing that consumer protection, they would like to see that institution authorized within their state. The next trigger that we're going to discuss is proctoring. This is the map for proctoring, and the list is a little smaller.
For internet marketing or advertising, you didn't mention internet included in that?
I can address that at the end. We'll have a time for questions at the end if that's okay. I will come back to that though, I promise. So for proctoring, these are the states that consider proctoring within their state to trigger a physical presence and need for state authorization. In Delaware, there's and it depends again, and they say that if it's in a classroom setting, so if you have a special case where your student for some reason has to go home and it's time for them to take an exam and you try to make arrangements with a professor that you know is giving a test on April 8th in their class, and you want your student to sit in on that to take their test to proctor it. In Delaware, that's not okay, but in Delaware, you can do one-on-one proctoring. If you have a professor at the University of Delaware and you know you've worked with him before and he can proctor that for your student and you need that to happen, that's okay. In the other states, the one-on-one proctoring is a trigger for state authorization, as well as classroom settings and any other forms of proctoring for assignments or tests. The next trigger that we're going to move to is one that really does apply on a large scale to NYU. This is probably the biggest one for us, and I think this will probably apply to majority of people in the room. Non-classroom experience, and this is defined as an internship, externship, clinical, practicum, fieldwork, clerkship, you name it, anything that falls within that category where a student is physically going to that state, whether they're going home to the state of Maryland and they want to do an internship that summer, or they want to go live with Uncle Bobby in Vermont. If they're physically going there, whether it's required for your program or an option for your program, for credit, not for credit, every state has their it depends oddities that they apply to this, but this is a really big area. And the chart is more complex than the other charts, as you can see, and it's incredibly small. You can't, is it okay if I do questions at the end? We will have time for them, so we'll come back to it, I promise. So you can see the chart is more complex than the other charts, and there are more states with notes. And this is the map, so you can see a lot of different colors, and very pretty, but very complex, and basically it's just a big mess. I could probably spend 30 minutes today discussing this trigger alone and taking you through details, but in essence there's really 51 different variations for this trigger, because every state has their own complex nature for this definition. And just to share a couple examples with you, for instance, Florida, they say you can't come into our state with non-classroom experience activity if it's in the form of a medical clerkship. So you can do internships, externships, practicums in Florida, but if it's a medical clerkship, they want to authorize and have some sort of knowledge or oversight of that activity happening. So that chart is available on our website, as well as the map for you to view in detail and become more familiar with that. So with all of these complexities, the next question that I always get is, what is this going to cost us? How much? Show me the money. And your options are an arm, a leg, or both. Unfortunately, it's not cheap, and we are aware that this is an institution-wide issue, and we're looking into the best approach to the problem in order to support the budgetary impositions on everyone in this room. So I don't have an answer for you yet of how it will be divided, but we are rigorously working on finding an answer for that. So to give you a summary of the complication of the cost and kind of give you an idea, this is a slide that depicts the fee structure dispersion. So